So at the beginning of the 2021 Rockhopper budget upgrade series, I mentioned that a fork upgrade might be too costly to fit the wallet-friendly theme. However, after some digging, I decided to give the super affordable Rockshox Judy Silver TK air fork a try. Now at around $170 US, it's pretty tough to pass up, but be sure to stick around to get my full take on this low-cost but feature-packed suspension fork. Was it a worthwhile upgrade for the Rockhopper? Let's sort it out. So for starters, this is an air shock, meaning that it uses an air spring rather than a heavier coil spring like the stock SR Suntour fork. Now air shock technology affords some pretty substantial benefits like lighter weight and adjustable, more progressive effective spring rates. Now this particular model is the Rockshox Judy Silver TK, which is basically the lowest level air shock they make. Now it's got 100 millimeters of travel, which is actually 10 millimeters more than the stock fork, but the crown race to dropout distance isn't a full 10 millimeters longer, so the geometry of the bike is minimally affected. Now it's the TK version, which stands for turnkey, which means it's got a lockout knob to limit the travel as you climb. As with all air shocks, it has a pretty typical Schrader valve to inflate the shock to the desired pressure, and it's got a rebound damping knob on the bottom with about 5 clicks ranging from minimally damped to a pretty slow return. Now the weight of this shock is about 2,100 grams, which isn't super light, but it is 600 grams less than the stock coil shock. Now for us here in the States, that's 1.3 pounds. Now that's actually some pretty massive weight savings, which is definitely noticeable while riding. As cost per weight savings ratios go, doesn't really get much better than this. Now this fork comes in a variety of wheel sizes and axle standards, but this one here is for 29-inch wheels with a 51mm offset, and it's suited for a standard quick release axle because that's what the Rockhopper Sport comes with. Also, it's a non-tapered straight steerer, which is a little bit uncommon these days, as it seems like most bikes are trending toward the stiffer tapered fork and headset combo. But the Rockhopper does indeed adopt the non-tapered headset, so this fork is a direct swap. Now the stanchions on the Rockshox measure in at 30 millimeters in diameter, which is about the same as the stock one, but I would say that the Judy does feel a little bit stiffer. Now the Judy uses standard post mounts for the brake calipers, so again, it was a direct swap from the stock fork. Now the finish is a really subdued gloss black with black stanchions and minimal branding, which I actually really appreciate. It'll look decent on almost any bike you put it on, which I'm guessing was the idea with the color scheme. Now installation is as simple as cutting the steerer to length, installing the crown race and the included star nut, and reinstalling the fork onto the bike. So I think that's basically it for the details and specs. The big question, of course, how does it ride? And was it a worthwhile upgrade for the Rockhopper build, or any budget mountain bike build for that matter? Well, of course it's all relative, but coming from the really basic coil fork with no rebound damping and no lockout, the Rockshox Judy here is a hugely transformative upgrade. And one of the things I noticed right away on the stock fork is that it's unmistakably pogo-y down rockier sections, and it tends to ping-pong you around the trail, making the ride really unpredictable and borderline unsafe. Now I think this type of suspension fork isn't really designed to be ridden that hard, and honestly it's more of a necessity just to have any type of suspension fork on there to make the bike look the part. Now in my experience with this bike, the stock fork really limits the capability of the bike, and you really have to show some restraint in order to keep things under control. Now with the adjustable spring rate and adjustable rebound damping on the Rockshox Judy, everything changes. Now I'm not trying to sell you on this fork or anything, but honestly coming from the stock coil fork, this Rockshox Judy might be one of the most impactful upgrades I made on the Rockhopper so far. Unruly sections of trail become much more manageable and composed, and even though it's only got 100 millimeters of travel, the fork performs really well within these limitations. Now I did mention that it's all relative. Coming from the stock coil spring, it's a fantastic upgrade. But compared to a nicer fork like the Revelation on my Hightower, which isn't a high-end fork by any means, but certainly more capable than the Judy, you do start to identify the shortcomings of this budget offering. Now with 30mm stanchions on the Judy, it's certainly not as stiff as I'm used to, and that translates to a little bit of unpredictability on the trails. Now the flex in the fork can leave the handling a little bit vague, which is to be expected on a budget build like this. Now the other thing is the quality of the rebound damping. I think it's got 5 clicks of rebound, but it's not progressive by any means. It almost feels like the first 3 or so clicks don't do much in the way of fine-tuning the rebound, and then the final 2 clicks finally kick in and you can actually feel the difference. Now I've been riding this fork at 1 click shy of full turtle, and it seems pretty optimal for my taste. Never go full turtle. Now the lockout seems to work pretty well, although if you really put a lot of force through the fork, it'll actually compress a little bit even when fully locked out. Now most of the time though, you're only going to be using the lockout to try and minimize the front end bob while climbing, so I don't really see it becoming an issue. Now the knob itself is definitely a pretty cheap plastic, and I feel like if it gets bashed once or twice, it could easily break off, so keep that in mind if you're really hard on your stuff. Inflating the shock is as simple as any other air shock, and it holds pressure well. I've been running this fork at about 85 psi, and it's pretty good for my weight of 155 pounds. Now you know it's an entry-level fork because it's got the little cheat sheet sticker on the side, but it was actually pretty helpful for getting the pressure setup right the first time. Well, like I said, coming from the stock SR Suntour fork on this Rockhopper, the upgrade to the Rockshox Judy fork was hugely transformative. Now, believe it or not, this upgrade basically wraps up the Rockhopper upgrade series, but I will put together a summary video and rank the upgrades in order of impact, and this fork is definitely going to be near the top. Now, for the price, I'm really happy with it, and I really have no complaints at all, aside from the slightly cheap feeling materials and the somewhat inconsistent rebound damping adjustment, both of which I think can be forgiven on a product at this price point. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed getting a closer look at the Rockshox Judy Silver TK suspension fork. Now, do I think it's a worthwhile upgrade for an entry-level mountain bike? Absolutely. For the money, I'm not sure it can be beat, to be honest. Now, I'll do a longer-term review if anything changes or if I identify any issues with longevity, but I'm not sure that I'll need to. Now, as always, thanks again for watching, and thanks again for subscribing if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time.